1964 film that's called Becket, and it stars Richard Burton. I don't know if you remember seeing that. He's playing the part of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. In this film, lines of monks come streaming into the cathedral, each holding about a 3-foot-long white candle lit. And Richard Burton, as Archbishop Becket, files in behind the rows of monks and walks up to the altar and stands, and also is holding a long white candle. He pronounces, as only Richard Burton could do, the excommunication and condemnation of Lord Gilbert Folliot, the Bishop of London, for murder and for sacrilege, for which he has remained unrepentant. We do here and now separate him from the precious body and blood of Christ, and from the society of all Christians. We exclude him from Holy Mother Church and all her sacraments in heaven or on earth. We excommunicate him, and we declare him excommunicate and anathema. We cast him into outer darkness. We judge him damned with the devil and his fallen angels and all the reprobates to eternal fire and everlasting pain. Now, Richard Burton could do that really well. And with that, he flips his long candle 180 degrees and stamps the flame out on the floor, and then casts the candle aside to the floor. And the monks who are there with him say, "So be it," and turn their candles 180 degrees, snuff the flame out on the floor, and cast them aside. I describe this scene because of today's gospel reading. Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." This is often referred to as the power of the keys. And the idea is that the church's pronouncements of condemnation and of mercy here on earth last for all eternity. When Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, excommunicates Lord Gilbert and condemns him to the fire and pain of hell for all eternity, that condemnation is supposed to stick forever and ever. Richard Burton may have made this sound quite convincing, but I'm not so sure it's a good idea. I do not think that people, no matter how religious or spiritual they may be, are quite capable of rendering judgments about other people that are completely consistent with the mind of God. Pope Leo X, in 1521, made a similar pronouncement of excommunication and eternal condemnation against Martin Luther and all of his followers. Now, the fact that we're gathered here today in the Lutheran Church suggests that we question the effectiveness of such a condemnation in terms of eternal pronouncements of damnation. The problem with what Jesus said about what Christians bind on earth being bound in heaven and what Christians loose on earth being loosed in heaven is that in practice, there's a pretty wide margin of error, don't you think? We don't always get it right. And it seems wrong to assume that if we condemn someone wrongly, that somehow or other God's judgment is bound by our judgment. Some of you may remember that for 18 years I worked as a pastoral counselor, offering psychotherapy for individuals, couples, and families. I've been told that I was a pretty good therapist, but there was one group of people that, as far as I know, I was completely unsuccessful in treating. And that was people who were addicted to heroin or other opioids. No success. Ever. Complete, utter failure. I learned that the only thing I could do was try to convince somebody to check into a treatment program. And if I couldn't convince them, to get a hold of their family members and get them to convince the person to get into a treatment program. And even if I was successful at that, the relapse rate was so very high that it seemed inevitable that this person was going to continue to have trouble for the rest of their life. And eventually I came to the conclusion that heroin or opioid addiction was simply a death sentence, and there was nothing I could do. I heard a story recently about an addict who had gone to a clinic and started treatment for heroin addiction. Now, withdrawal from heroin can have a number of painful and very unpleasant side effects, and there is a medication that can be prescribed to help people get through those side effects. The only thing is that whereas you can quit heroin or opioids and just feel bad for a number of days or weeks, if you take this medication, if you quit the medication, you could die. You have to taper off this medication. Well, the problem was that this person who was addicted to heroin and who had started treatment and who was on this medication got arrested and was put in jail. And the deputies in the jail did not give her that medication. And when she went into withdrawal from that medication, they figured, oh yeah, just another junkie in withdrawal from heroin. And they did nothing. And she died. Apparently, her symptoms were mistaken for heroin withdrawal. And hearing this story, I get the impression that the deputies keeping the jail thought that this was just another hopeless addict craving drugs. The person was written off and died as a result of neglect. Medical treatment was needed, not a judgmental attitude and neglect. And I feel badly because I often had that attitude. Nothing can be done. I'm not convinced that we're capable of doing much better than that when it comes to judging someone's immortal soul. A friend of mine works at a mission in another city, a mission that serves homeless people. And one of the clients at this mission, who is obviously off of her medications and having great difficulty, she wouldn't come inside of the mission, not even when it was cold and she could freeze, but instead she camped out in an alley back behind the mission. She was often dirty and smelly. She was often very psychologically unstable to the point that she would lash out violently at anyone who tried to help her. And my friend consistently tried to offer help. Every evening she would go back to the mission and go find this woman out in one of the alleys behind the mission, and she would bring her food. And from time to time, when it got really cold, she would gain the cooperation of the police to go and have her arrested and put in jail so that she wouldn't freeze. And there she would get a couple of meals, and she would get cleaned up and actually get some new clothes and would be back out on the street. This friend of mine would go and find this woman late in the evening, and she would try to talk with her. And sometimes this woman would lash out and hit my friend. This seems like a hopeless case. A hopeless case if you ever heard of one. But there was something. My friend recognized that this woman was educated. And in rare instances when she was coherent, she could tell that she probably came from a good family. My friend cared for this homeless woman, both in the times that she would come into the mission, which was rare, but more often as she would find her out behind the mission. And this went on for about 2 years. During that time, my friend hired a private investigator. She paid her out of her own pocket to try to figure out who this woman was and if she had family. Well, in an amazing turn of events, the investigator discovered that not only did the woman belong to a family, but that the family had been looking for her for years. The woman obviously, had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. She had wandered off from her family, going to visit a friend of hers in another town, and she ended up going from town to town and ended up where my friend lives. When the woman's family got in touch with my friend, she went to the police. She had this woman arrested and put in jail so that when the family came down to get her, they'd be able to find her again. Later on, after she returned to her home, my friend received a phone call from the family. And this woman got on the phone, speaking coherently back on her medications, and invited her to come and visit her. And the family sent a private jet to come and get her. The ending of this story seems miraculous, completely unexpected. Once this woman was back with her family, back on her medications, she was fairly normal. But you know, she's the sort of person that any of us would easily write off as hopeless. Yet, in the care of her family, she was a different person. I'm not so sure of our ability to judge accurately. We have too many prejudices. Sometimes we don't have enough hope in the power of love and of community. Some of you may remember that back in 2006, as I was serving as your interim pastor, that my mother died in June of 2006. Back in the 1930s, when my mother married her first husband, she was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church. He wasn't Catholic, he was a spiritualist, is what he was, and she didn't agree that their children would be raised in the Roman Catholic Church, and so, you know, she's cut off. Well, she was widowed and moved to Washington, D.C. area, and eventually met my father, and she went and made peace with the church. She had been excommunicated, probably not in Richard Burton dramatic style, but she had been excommunicated. And she married my father, and she got things, you know, squared up, and she was back in good graces. And that went along fine until my father died. And a little while later, she took up with Otto Wenger and intended to marry him, and went to the church in order to get married, and found out that no, this would not be possible because he was a divorced Episcopalian. And that was a no-no. Well, if he would apply for an annulment from the Catholic Church, from his divorce as an Episcopalian, that everything would be fine. But they decided not to do that, and so my mother, you know, gets excommunicated again for the second time for marrying the wrong kind of person. In her later years, she was living down the road in Gainesville, Georgia, and there was a group of Eucharistic ministers from the Catholic Church across the street from the senior apartments where she was living, who would come across, and on a morning they would hold a prayer service and sing a couple of hymns, and they would distribute Holy Communion as an extension of the celebration of communion in that congregation on Sunday. And my mother really enjoyed receiving communion from these Eucharistic ministers, but being an excommunicated Catholic, she wanted to get things right again. And so she went across the street to the church, and she sat down with the priest, and she had a conversation, and he told her that if she confessed that marrying Otto Wenger was a mortal sin, and that she should not have done that, that then everything could be put right. Now, my mother could have told you dozens of reasons why marrying Otto was a bad idea. But she wasn't going to confess that it was a mortal sin. She didn't buy that. And so she politely said no and came back to her apartment. But somehow, the Eucharistic ministers did not get the memo that she was an excommunicated Catholic, and so when they would come across the street to where she was living, she would still continue to go to the prayer services, and she would still continue to receive communion, and when she moved from there into assisted living, they figured out where she was. And they followed her there. And they would bring her communion. And then in February of 2006, when she had a major stroke and had to go into a nursing home, guess what? The same Eucharistic ministers followed her to the nursing home. One time I was visiting my mom, and I noticed something white was in her mouth. I thought maybe this was a piece of paper or something. I didn't know how it had gotten there, and I fished in my mother's mouth, and sure enough, here's a little sliver of a communion wafer. What do you do with this now? You know, a little dilemma there. But what I realized was that these people from that congregation were being faithful in the ministry of reconciliation. I would like to believe that the mercy that we show, the attempts that we make at reconciliation, can have lasting effect, even eternal effect. That as people become part of a community, even if it's only a community of two out behind a mission, even a family community, even a small gathering at a bedside, that Jesus is there in the midst, bringing forgiveness, reconciliation, and hope. Jesus said, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them." And where Jesus is, there is also forgiveness, reconciliation, acceptance, and community. Now, in our first reading, we're told that we ought to stand up and speak out when there is wrong in the world. And I think that we can be pretty good at deliberating about and discussing and coming to conclusions about isms, about ways of thinking. I think that we can judge racism and white supremacy as wrong and against the will of God. I think that we can look at the fruits of Nazism and judge that it is wrong. But what I'm uncomfortable with is judging people, especially when we are quick to want to punch their tickets to hell. In an interview this past week, Presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton was asked if she thought there was a hell. "There may be," she said, "but I think it's empty," she added. Now, doubtless, she will be criticized for saying this, but she went on to make a good point. She said, "God doesn't give up on us." And I would like to add, God doesn't give up on you. God doesn't give up on me. God doesn't give up on the people that you and I would give up on. We may be ineffective in the face of addiction. We may be hopeless in the face of sickness or poverty. We may be incensed in the face of unrestrained greed. We may give up on institutions that are supposed to be doing good, yet God is more patient than we are. And God has all eternity to reach us and to reconcile us to God's own self. Amen.
Amen.